Hey viewers! Hope you're all doing great. Before I start the story, tell me in the comments which country you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you enjoy my videos, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Do you hear it? The faint echo of coins. Not clinking but whispering. A sound from the heart of Renaissance Italy. From a city built not on war, but on promises. Florence. Imagine the narrow cobblestone streets, the scent of olive oil and parchment, the murmuring crowds moving between stalls of silk and spices. But hidden beneath that beauty, under the art and poetry, there's something else, something invisible, yet powerful enough to shape empires. Money, but not the way you think. Because before Florence, there was no bank as we know it. There was only gold. And gold, as the Florentines discovered, could be turned into power. Let's go back to the 1300s, a world trembling between faith and fortune. The church ruled hearts, kings ruled lands. But Florence, oh Florence, ruled with numbers. The city wasn't large, yet its ideas were vast. Merchants from all over Europe, from London, from Bruges, from Constantinople, came to Florence not only to trade goods, but to trust Florentine bankers with their gold. And among those bankers, one family would rise. Quietly at first, then magnificently. The Medici. But before the Medici became a dynasty, before their name filled the halls of art and cathedrals, there was just a simple concept. Trust. You see, gold was heavy, dangerous to carry. Thieves waited at every road. So Florentine merchants began using paper. Promises written in ink. A note, a letter of credit, saying, I deposit 10 florins here, you can collect them there. It was safer, lighter, smarter. And with that simple innovation, the world's first form of modern banking began to breathe. The goldsmiths of Florence became keepers of both wealth and secrets. Their benches, banco in Italian, were where customers came to sit and exchange. From banco came the word bank. But where there is trust, there is temptation. And where there is money, there is always power. Picture this. A young man named Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, modest yet ambitious, sitting behind a wooden desk. Sunlight touches the gold coins stacked beside him, while parchment contracts lie open before him. He looks calm, but his eyes are calculating. He knows something that others don't. That gold is not the goal. Control is. Giovanni begins lending to popes and princes, not just merchants. When the church needs money to fund a crusade or build a cathedral, they come to him. He lends, discreetly, earning both profit and favor. Soon, the Medici name becomes whispered among cardinals, among rulers. But Florence was never a peaceful city. Rival families, the Albizzi, the Strozzi, watched the Medici rise with envy. The marketplace became a battlefield of numbers. Loans became weapons. And every coin moved like a chess piece in a larger game. The suspense deepens. Because what Giovanni started would not end with him. His son, Cosimo de' Medici, would inherit not just wealth, but the art of influence. Florence would become his stage. And from the shadows of his counting house, Cosimo would rule the city like a ghost behind velvet curtains. But not yet. For now, Florence still hums with possibility. The smell of ink and beeswax fills the banking halls. Clerks whisper exchange rates in hushed tones. Gold leaves the city in wagons, and paper promises travel in its place. Faster, safer, and more powerful than armies. Outside, artists and architects work under the same patrons who lend to kings. Money fuels creation. Michelangelo's marble, Brunelleschi's dome, Botticelli's brush, all trace their roots back to the Medici's gold. Yet as beauty rises, so does danger. Because the more powerful the Medici become, the more enemies they gather. And then, one day a papal messenger arrives. A sealed letter, a new alliance, or a warning. Cosimo's heart beats softly in the candlelight as he reads. The letter will change everything. But before we open it, pause. Breathe. Feel the city around you. The heartbeat of Florence, slow and steady, pulsing through marble walls and gilded ledgers. This is where money learned to move without metal. This is where invisible power was born. Softly, as if whispering through centuries, the forgotten banks of Florence didn't just store gold. They invented the idea of trust and the illusion of wealth. And in that illusion, whole empires found their fate. The tone remains soft, cinematic, and immersive, a quiet voice guiding you through the shadowed corridors of Renaissance Florence. The letter trembles slightly in Cosimo's hands. A seal of the Pope, a crimson thread binding the parchment. The candlelight dances across his face as he breaks it open, slowly, carefully, as though unwrapping fate itself. Inside, there are words that would make any man's pulse quicken. Papacy wants a banker. Partner. Cosimo closes his eyes for a moment. The room feels smaller, the air heavier. He knows what this means. If the Medici Bank serves the Pope, it will not just handle gold. It will handle God's money. It was the 1420s. Florence was beautiful, restless, alive, and divided. The city's walls kept out enemies, but inside those walls, families battled for influence. The Albizzi ruled politics. The Medici ruled credit. But soon they would rule everything. Cosimo de' Medici, quiet and deliberate, was not like other men of power. He didn't crave titles or crowns. He understood that true control was invisible, whispered, not shouted. A coin placed in the right hand could do more than 1,000 swords. He begins to weave a network, not of soldiers but of debt. Princes owe him. Merchants owe him. Even the church begins to depend on him. Gold moves through the Medici Bank like blood through veins, and Florence is its beating heart. But power in Florence never goes unnoticed. Rinaldo degli Albizzi, proud and sharp-tongued, begins to see the Medici as a threat to the old order. He warns the city's elite. Cosimo hides behind his accounts, but his goal is the throne. One autumn morning, as the sun stretches over the Arno River, soldiers arrive at the Medici Palace. Their armor glints like silver fish in the dawn. Cosimo watches them enter. He knows resistance is useless. He is arrested, charged with treason against the Republic. They say his fortune has corrupted Florence, that his money has bought loyalty and poisoned the city's freedom. He is imprisoned in the Palazzo Vecchio, a tower of cold stone and colder intentions. As the heavy door shuts behind him, Florence outside falls silent, waiting. Inside his cell, Cosimo sits with nothing but shadows. No gold, no ledgers, no allies. Only the echo of his own heartbeat. For days he listens, to footsteps, to whispers, to the ticking of time. He knows that fortunes are fragile, and that everything he built might vanish in one decision. But Cosimo was not a man who broke easily. He begins to think, not about escape but strategy. Money had made him powerful once. Perhaps it could save him now. A guard slips a note through the bars. A loyal friend, one of his clerks, has bribed the right men. There is talk among the judges. There is a price for everything. Cosimo smiles faintly. In Florence, even justice can be financed. Within a week, the charges are reconsidered. His enemies plan exile, not execution. And so, Cosimo de' Medici walks out of his cell, into the cool Florentine morning. A free man, but not a safe one. The Republic orders him to leave Florence immediately. He does not protest. He bows his head, and obeys. As he leaves through the city gates, the people whisper. Some call him a tyrant, others a savior, but no one forgets his name. He travels north to Venice, a city of canals and commerce, where money glides like water. And while he lives quietly in exile, he listens. He writes. He waits. Meanwhile, back in Florence, everything begins to crumble. The Albizzi seize power, but their hands are clumsy. Trade falters. Confidence dies. Without the Medici Bank, the city's economy suffocates. Letters begin to arrive in Venice. Pleas from merchants, friends, allies in secret. Come back. Florence needs you. And then, something remarkable happens. The very men who exiled Cosimo now beg for his return. It is 1434. Cosimo rides once again through the city gates of Florence, not as a victim, but as a victor. The crowds cheer this time. Bells ring. Gold confetti falls from the windows of grateful merchants. Even the cathedral bells seem to echo his name. Florence has chosen its ruler. Not a king, not a general, but a banker. Cosimo moves swiftly, wisely. He forgives publicly, but remembers privately. He rebuilds the Medici Bank into the most powerful financial institution in Europe. Its branches stretch from Rome to London, from Geneva to Bruges, and every coin that changes hands strengthens his web. He begins to fund artists, not for vanity, but for legacy. He pays Brunelleschi to complete the great dome of Florence's cathedral, a marvel of engineering. He sponsors scholars, architects, poets. Each one becomes a reflection of his influence. Florence glows with a new kind of wealth. Not just gold, but genius. Cosimo becomes Cosimo il Vecchio. Cosimo the Elder, father of Florence's rebirth. But late at night, when the city sleeps, he sits alone in his study. He gazes at the ledgers, pages filled with numbers that represent lives, power, faith. He wonders quietly if he has created prosperity or illusion, for in the same breath that built Florence's greatness, he also built its dependence, and dependence, he knows, is just another kind of cage. The flame flickers low. A draft passes through the hall, carrying the scent of wax and old parchment. Cosimo looks out toward the river, the Arno, glimmering under moonlight. Somewhere beyond that river, in the dark streets of the city, someone is plotting again, because power in Florence never sleeps. Soft whisper, and where gold flows, shadows always follow. The city had changed. Florence was no longer a patchwork of rival merchants. It had become a living organism, pulsing to the rhythm of the Medici Bank. Cosimo de' Medici had returned, not as a man, but as an idea. Quiet, calculating, and deeply rooted. He spoke softly, dressed simply, and yet every decision in Florence now passed, directly or indirectly, through him. His first act was not revenge. It was architecture. He summoned the architect Filippo Brunelleschi, a man mocked by others as eccentric, impossible, perhaps even mad. Brunelleschi's dream was bold: to complete the great dome of Santa Maria del Fiore, the cathedral that had stood unfinished for decades. No one believed it could be done. The span was too wide, the weight too great. Cosimo leaned forward, his voice low. Let Florence see what faith and geometry can do. And so, under his patronage, stone by stone, the impossible began to rise. Workers perched like birds high above the city, hoisting marble and brick in silence. The dome swelled into the sky, a crown not for a king, but for an idea. When it was completed, people said, "God built it." But in quiet whispers they added, "And the Medici paid for it." The city glowed with new pride. Gold flowed again. Trade routes reopened. The Medici Bank became the most trusted name in Europe. Branches opened in Rome, Geneva, Venice, and London. In each city, Medici agents recorded transactions in elegant Latin, balancing ledgers that connected popes and princes alike. A nobleman in France could pay a merchant in Bruges, without ever touching a coin. Instead, he would send a letter of credit, stamped with the Medici seal. It was money made invisible, but with invisibility came danger. Even a whisper of lost trust could bring ruin. And in Rome, where politics danced with sin, trust was always fleeting. The papacy itself had become a market of souls. Cardinals competed for influence, bishops bought titles, and beneath the sacred frescoes of the Vatican, gold changed hands in secret. Cosimo understood this world perfectly. He became the banker to the Holy See, the financial shadow of the Church. The Medici Bank managed tithes, indulgences, and even crusade funds. Their profits grew beyond measure, but their influence grew even faster. In Florence, art blossomed like spring after rain. Sculptors, painters, and scholars found shelter in the Medici's patronage. Donatello carved marble saints with eyes so human they seemed to breathe. Fra Angelico painted heaven itself upon monastery walls. Each stroke of color, each chisel mark, was another thread in Cosimo's tapestry, a legacy not of conquest but creation. Yet, beneath all this beauty, Florence trembled. Wealth had made it bright and fragile. Every coin that glittered under candlelight cast a shadow. The merchants grew restless. The nobles whispered that Cosimo had become too powerful, that he ruled not by law, but by debt. Still he smiled. He had learned that power was safest when it wore humility. He attended church daily, spoke modestly, and dressed like a merchant rather than a prince. He let others believe they ruled, while his bank ruled them all. In the late nights, inside the Medici palace, his clerks worked by oil lamps. Their quills scratched on parchment, turning debts into destiny. The room smelled of wax, ink, and quiet ambition. Every number on those pages represented trust. Fragile, sacred trust. One wrong figure, one dishonest loan, could break the entire illusion. And then came a letter from Rome, sealed with the papal crest again. Pope Eugenius IV had fled his own city, driven out by rebellion. He needed money, soldiers, and sanctuary. He turned to the only man who could provide all three. Cosimo sent gold. He offered protection. And soon, the Pope himself came to Florence, a guest under the Medici roof. 4 months, the Holy Father lived in Cosimo's city, while the banker quietly managed his debts. It was said that during that time, Florence became the center of Christendom, not by divine decree, but by the balance sheets of one man. When the Council of Florence convened in 1439, an attempt to unite the Eastern and Western churches, the city shone with an almost. Florence had become something new. Something alive, glowing from within. Cosimo de' Medici had turned trade into trust, and trust into quiet dominion. Under his shadow, the city hummed like a well-tuned instrument, its strings pulled by invisible hands. But time in Florence never stood still. Every moment of peace carried the echo of ambition. And from the heart of the Medici palace, a plan was unfolding that would forever bind money and art, faith and politics. A design so intricate that even God's house, the church itself, would feel its reach. It began with Rome. For centuries, the papacy had been rich in relics, but poor in management. Popes dreamed of cathedrals, crusades, and crowns, but dreams demanded coin. And where there was need, the Medici always listened. The Medici Bank opened its Roman branch in quiet ceremony. Marble floors gleamed like mirrors. Candles burned in silver holders. Clerks bent over thick ledgers, their quills scratching gently across parchment. The Pope's treasurer, a cautious man named Giovanni Vitelleschi, watched them count and write, like monks performing a ritual of numbers. Soon, the Medici were entrusted with the papal accounts. Money from indulgences, offerings, and tithes began to flow not into Rome's vaults, but through Florence. Gold from faith now passed through the hands of a banker. And in that simple exchange, the Medici became richer than kings. But Cosimo, even in his success, remained careful. He wore simple robes. He spoke softly. He kept no throne, no crown. He ruled from shadows, through gestures and gifts. He believed in appearances. That power was safest when hidden beneath humility. And so, while others boasted, he built libraries filled with Greek manuscripts, chapels adorned with frescoes. He invited philosophers from Byzantium, men who carried the lost wisdom of Plato and Aristotle. Florence became not just a city of gold, but of mind. Artists began to gather under his patronage. Donatello, Fra Angelico, Filippo Lippi. Each one painted or sculpted not for mere beauty, but for eternity. And every masterpiece carried, somewhere in its corners, the quiet signature of Medici gold. The Renaissance was not born in a blaze of light. It was whispered into existence through parchment, pigment, and patience. Yet for every admirer Cosimo gained, an enemy waited in silence. In the palaces of Florence, resentment simmered. The Strozzi family, wealthy rivals, whispered that Cosimo had bewitched the city, that his loans were chains, his gifts were traps. Florence, they said, no longer belongs to its people. It belongs to his purse. But when the people looked around them, what did they see? Churches rising higher than before. Markets bustling with merchants. Scholars debating under porticos. Artists painting the divine. Florence thrived. And so, they turned away from envy and towards gratitude. Cosimo was no tyrant in their eyes. He was their guardian, the man who gave the city its heartbeat. Still, in the quiet corners of his study, Cosimo felt something shift. His body was aging, and his heart, once sharp as a blade, began to soften. He thought often of legacy, of the fragile web he had woven between money and mercy. He feared what would happen when he was gone, for though he ruled with grace, his son Piero was sickly, a man of weaker health and uncertain strength. Would the Medici name survive? Would Florence remain under their careful order, or fall once again into chaos? The answer, Cosimo knew, lay not in his ledgers, but in his bloodline. One evening, as the sun bled over the rooftops of Florence, he called for his grandson, a boy of just 17 named Lorenzo. Bright eyes, sharp mind. Cosimo saw something in him, a spark that could keep the fire burning. "Remember," he told the boy softly, his voice trembling like parchment, "wealth is a tool, not a throne. Use it to build, never to boast. The city listens to kindness longer than to command." The boy nodded. In that moment, something passed between them, a legacy not of gold, but of wisdom. Outside, the bells of Santa Maria del Fiore rang through the dusk. Florence was golden, peaceful, radiant, unaware that beneath its calm, the next generation of Medici ambition was already stirring. Cosimo would not live to see how far his family would rise, nor how far they would fall. But his foundations were solid, his name immortal. And through every vault and ledger, through every painted chapel and hidden loan, Florence carried his echo. The banker had become the city's soul. And in the shimmering twilight, as his servants closed the windows of his chamber, Cosimo looked one last time toward the dome that Brunelleschi had built, the dome his money had made possible. He smiled faintly. Florence was safe. Now, softly, fading voice. But history has a way of collecting its debts. The light dims, the sound of quill and parchment fades into stillness. And somewhere far away, a new Medici stirs awake, one who will not only inherit gold but destiny. The years drifted softly through Florence, like the slow turning of a silk fan. Cosimo was gone now. His son, Piero, frail and cautious, held the reins of the Medici Bank. But it was his son, young Lorenzo, who began to draw the city's attention. Lorenzo de' Medici, the magnificent. He was not yet a ruler, merely a young man of promise. But even in youth, there was something magnetic about him. He walked through the streets of Florence not with soldiers, but with poets and painters. He spoke with scholars, laughed with merchants, and listened to the people in a way few men of wealth ever did. Where Cosimo had ruled from the shadows, Lorenzo stepped into the light. He believed that beauty itself could hold a city together, that art could be the language of power. Under his touch, Florence bloomed again. He gathered around him minds that would shape the soul of Europe. Botticelli, with his golden brush. Leonardo da Vinci, still young, restless, observant. Michelangelo, barely a boy, already sculpting miracles from stone. The Medici Palace became more than a home. It was a heartbeat. Every corridor whispered with the sound of poetry and philosophy. Lorenzo paid for artists' tools, scholars' ink, architects' dreams. He believed that to invest in genius was to invest in eternity. But Florence, as always, carried two faces. By day it sparkled. By night it plotted. Beyond the domes and frescoes, envy waited like a shadow on the wall. Other families, the Pazzi, the Salviati, watched Lorenzo's rise with clenched teeth. They saw not a patron of the arts, but a man slowly bending the Republic around his will. The Medici Bank, now richer than ever, reached every corner of Europe. Its letters of credit were honored in Paris, Bruges, even London. Pope Sixtus IV himself borrowed from Lorenzo's vaults. And in that dangerous intimacy between banker and church, the seeds of betrayal were quietly sown. It began with a refusal. When the Pope sought a loan for his nephew, to purchase land near Florence, Lorenzo declined. It was not pride but prudence. The terms were too costly, the risk too high. But to the Pope, refusal felt like insult. Sixtus turned elsewhere, to the Puzzi family. Ambitious, hungry for power, they seized the chance to become the Church's new favorites. And in the candlelit halls of Rome, a terrible idea began to take shape. If the Medici would not yield their power, they would have to be removed. Spring 1478. The air in Florence was soft with the scent of lilies. Inside the great cathedral, the Duomo, the people gathered for Sunday Mass. Sunlight spilled through stained glass, painting the marble floor in crimson and gold. Lorenzo stood beside his brother, Giuliano, tall, graceful, unaware of the danger coiling near them. As the choir's voices rose to the heavens, a signal was given. Knives flashed. Giuliano fell to the ground, struck again and again by blades that glinted in the holy light. Lorenzo turned, felt the slice of steel against his skin, but by instinct, by fate, he survived. The cathedral erupted in chaos. Screams echoed through the dome that Cosimo's gold had built. Blood ran where holy water once had. Lorenzo, bleeding but alive, was rushed to safety. He locked himself inside the sacristy with loyal friends, while outside, the assassin's plan unraveled. The people of Florence, furious and loyal, rose like a storm. They seized the conspirators, dragged them through the streets. The bells tolled not for prayer, but for vengeance. By nightfall, the Puzzi conspiracy was crushed. Bodies hung from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria, the same place where Cosimo had once been imprisoned. History had come full circle. And through it all, Lorenzo stood calm. His face pale, his voice steady. He had lost his brother, but gained something far greater, the soul of Florence. From that day forward, he ruled not just by wealth, but by love. The people called him Il Magnifico. To them he was more than a banker, more than a leader. He was the living spirit of the city. But inside, Lorenzo carried a quiet grief. At night, he would walk alone through the Medici gardens, listening to the fountains, the wind through olive trees. He thought of his brother, of his grandfather, of the fragile line that tied beauty to blood. He began to pour even more of himself into art, as if creation could silence the ache. He commissioned Botticelli's Primavera, a dream of spring and rebirth. He supported scholars who translated Plato and rediscovered the ancient world. Florence glowed brighter than ever, but beneath that glow, cracks began to form. The Medici Bank, stretched across continents, began to strain under the weight of bad loans. Wars in distant lands disrupted trade. Princes who once repaid with gratitude now defaulted with excuses. Even the papacy, fickle as always, began to turn cold. Lorenzo's fortune waned, but his resolve did not. He turned to diplomacy, weaving alliances, balancing peace between rival states. For a time it worked. Italy breathed easy. But peace, like wealth, never lasts. The art flourished. People adored him. Yet in secret, debt piled high, like the quiet toll of a clock counting toward its end. And when Lorenzo looked at Florence, the marble domes, the painted chapels, the golden streets, he wondered, just as Cosimo once had, have I built paradise, or illusion? He smiled softly, the candlelight catching in his eyes. He knew the answer didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that Florence believed. And belief, he understood, was more powerful than gold. Because in Florence, money was never truly about metal. It was about faith. In beauty, in promise, in the men who dared to dream. Time, gentle as dust, began to settle on Florence. The air still shimmered with the fragrance of art, but beneath that perfume, the scent of decay began to creep in. Lorenzo de' Medici, Il Magnifico, was no longer the radiant young man who filled the city with laughter and song. His hair had thinned. His hands trembled slightly as he wrote. The lines on his face deepened, not from age alone, but from burden. The Medici Bank, once the golden heart of Europe, had grown too vast, too trusting. Branches in Rome, London, and Bruges had fallen into the hands of greedy managers. Loans had been made to kings who could not, or would not, repay. The world that once danced to the Medici's rhythm was changing its tune. Lorenzo sat in his study, surrounded by parchment, ledgers filled with numbers that no longer made sense. Outside, the city glowed as always, but he knew the truth. Florence's beauty was being built on borrowed time. Yet he refused despair. He wrote letters to princes and popes, seeking peace among Italy's warring states. He funded scholars, fed the poor, kept the illusion of stability alive. He knew that power was not about being unbroken, but about appearing unbroken. At night, he would walk through the cloisters of San Marco, where Fra Angelico's frescoes watched silently from the walls. He felt the stillness of the monastery calm his thoughts, and he began to wonder if Florence, and he himself, had wandered too far from faith. In those same corridors, a voice had begun to rise. Preacher. A Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola. He was not a man of gold or art. He was fire wrapped in cloth, tall, gaunt, eyes like dark glass. He spoke of sin, of corruption, of God's wrath upon Florence. He thundered from the pulpit of San Marco that the Medici had poisoned the soul of the city. Your paintings, he cried, are idols. Your wealth an abomination. Your beauty a mask for rot. First people ignored him. Florence was still too dazzled by its own brilliance. But Savonarola's words lingered. They fell into the cracks of Florence's conscience, and slowly they began to grow. By 1492 Lorenzo's health was failing. He lay in his villa at Careggi, the spring air carrying the scent of cypress and distant rain. The world he had built, the art, the politics, the splendor, seemed to hover like a dream fading at dawn. He called for Savonarola. The friar came, his black robe brushing the floor. Lorenzo asked for his blessing, for forgiveness. But Savonarola, stern and unyielding, demanded three things first. Confess your sins, give up your wealth, and restore liberty to Florence. Lorenzo's breath was shallow. He nodded to the first. He hesitated at the second. And at the third, he was silent. Savonarola turned, offered no comfort, and left. Moments later Lorenzo de' Medici, the magnificent, was gone. Florence mourned, but uneasily. The bells tolled through the city that his gold had built. Painters wept. Poets fell silent. But in the streets whispers spread. The Medici are finished. Lorenzo's son Piero, called the Unfortunate, took his father's place. He was handsome, arrogant, and utterly unprepared. He inherited wealth that was fading, allies who were enemies, and a city that no longer believed in miracles. Within months the storm arrived. King Charles VIII of France crossed the Alps with an army. Thousands of soldiers, armored and hungry. He came not for Florence alone, but for Italy itself. Cities surrendered before him like dominoes of marble. And when he reached Florence, he demanded tribute. Gold, loyalty, submission. Piero panicked. He agreed to every demand. He handed over fortresses, treasure, and honor without a fight. Florence was furious. The people who had once adored the Medici now spat their name in anger. They rose up. Crowds flooded the streets, shouting for liberty, for revenge. Windows of the Medici palace were shattered. Paintings torn, statues toppled. Piero fled in the night, the same way his great-grandfather Cosimo had once been exiled. But unlike Cosimo, he would never return. The Medici were gone, and in their place, Savonarola stepped forward. The friar who had once shouted in the shadows now ruled from the pulpit. He declared Florence reborn, not as a city of gold but of God. He banned dancing, music, and fine clothes. He ordered the bonfire of the vanities, a pyre of books, paintings, mirrors, jewels. Flames rose into the sky, consuming the very art that Lorenzo had nurtured. The same city that had once painted angels now watched them burn. But even fire cannot cleanse forever. Soon, Savonarola's own purity began to fracture. All that he had condemned, he began to command. He claimed visions, prophecies, divine authority. The people who had loved him grew afraid of him. And when the Pope excommunicated him, the city turned once again. In the Piazza della Signoria, the same square where the Pazzi conspirators had once hung, Savonarola met his own fate. The preacher who had cursed gold died in the fire's glow, his ashes carried by the same Florentine wind that once sang with bells. And so the city fell silent again. Without the Medici, without the friar, Florence was a ghost of its own glory. But history, like the Arno River, always returns to its course. Somewhere beyond the walls in the hills of Tuscany, a young man watched and waited. His name, Giovanni. A Medici once more. He would return. He would reclaim. He would wear not just Florence's crown, but the Pope's. Soft whisper fades, almost inaudible. The age of bankers was ending. The age of power reborn through faith was about to begin. The clinking of coins echoed through Florence like a heartbeat. Each sound, a promise, a secret, a whisper of trust and betrayal. By the mid-1400s, Florence had become something that no other city in Europe yet was. An empire not of land, but of ledgers. Its power was drawn not from armies or fortresses, but from faith in the Medici name. The Medici Bank had branches stretching from London to Bruges, from Rome to Constantinople. Gold flowed in and out of the city like the Arno River itself, glittering, deceptive, unstoppable. If you stood on the Ponte Vecchio bridge in those days, you might have seen merchants in long wool cloaks speaking softly, exchanging sealed letters. Those letters were not poems or personal notes. They were the lifeblood of global finance. Bills of exchange. No gold crossed borders now. Only paper did. It was faster, safer, almost magical. The Medici had invented trust as a currency. Inside the bank's counting rooms, sunlight streamed through tall windows, striking the polished tables where clerks worked in silence. They dipped their quills into ink and recorded transactions in perfect script. The books were divided, debit on one side, credit on the other. For the first time, numbers told stories. Stories of merchants in faraway ports, of spices from Alexandria, of English wool and French silver. Every figure in those ledgers was a fragment of the world, measured and controlled by Florentine minds. But power breeds shadows. Beneath the calm surface of Florence's wealth, tension brewed. The church frowned upon usury, the lending of money with interest, calling it sin. Yet, the Medici and other bankers cleverly disguised it. They used complex contracts, delayed payments, and trading maneuvers that turned sin into service. Money was hidden in words. Morality was wrapped in parchment. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, the founder, had taught his sons one golden rule: appear humble, but hold the purse. Cosimo de' Medici, his successor, lived by it. Outwardly a quiet man, dressed modestly, moving through Florence like a shadow. Inwardly, he was the most powerful man in Europe. Popes owed him money. Princes asked him for favors. And yet, he bowed his head in church like any common man. In the evenings, when the city's bells tolled and the air smelled of olive oil and candle wax, Cosimo would walk alone through the narrow streets, past the Duomo, feeling the pulse of his creation. Florence was alive because of him, and yet it could destroy him in a heartbeat. Rival families, the Albizzi, the Strozzi, watched him with envy. They whispered that he was turning the city into his private kingdom. And in truth he was. Through loans, he owned half the noble houses of Florence. Through influence he guided the elections. Through the church he reached Rome itself. The Pope's treasury, the richest in Christendom, was handled by the Medici Bank. The keys of St. Peter and the keys of Florence were held by the same hand. Still, beneath the gold and glory, a question haunted the air. How long can power built on trust truly last? There was one particular evening, described by chroniclers, when Cosimo stood in the Palazzo Medici courtyard, watching the flicker of torches on the marble walls. "Gold," he murmured to his steward, "is the most obedient servant, until the day it decides to master its owner." The steward did not understand, but history would. Florence glowed at night, the lamps reflecting in the Arno like stars fallen into water. Artists and thinkers gathered in the Medici salons. Brunelleschi spoke of domes that could touch heaven. Young painters whispered about light and shadow. While they dreamed of beauty, Cosimo dreamed of balance sheets. Yet he was no tyrant, he saw beauty as investment. He funded art the way he funded trade, expecting return not in coins but in immortality. And so, the age of the Renaissance rose quietly on the backs of bankers. Without the Medici, there might have been no Michelangelo, no Leonardo, no Botticelli. Gold turned into paint. Accounts became frescoes. The divine was financed. But in the silence of his private chapel, Cosimo sometimes prayed longer than usual. He had built an empire of invisible walls, and he knew, every wall casts a shadow. Behind every coin's gleam was someone's hunger, someone's debt, someone's silence. Outside Florence slept, the city of marble and money, of saints and sinners, of faith and finance. And somewhere in that sleep, a whisper drifted through the dark corridors of the Medici palace. "Gold never sleeps." That whisper would soon prove true. The Medici were about to discover that fortune, like the tide, can turn without warning, and that even in the city that invented money, there is a price no banker can pay. Florence awoke one morning to the sound of bells, not the soft call of prayer, but the hard, urgent toll that signaled danger. Whispers ran through the markets and courtyards. Cosimo de' Medici has been arrested. The richest man in Italy, the banker of popes, was suddenly a prisoner in his own city. His rivals, the Albizzi, had moved swiftly, accusing him of corruption and treason. For a city that owed its very pulse to Medici gold, Florence was now holding its breath. Inside the dark stone cell of the Palazzo Vecchio, Cosimo sat silently, his hands folded. The air was cold and damp, yet his face was calm, almost serene. He had always known that wealth was never safe in plain sight. His enemies didn't want his death. They wanted his absence. Power without presence could be erased in days. But Cosimo had built something stronger than walls. He had built loyalty. In the markets, merchants whispered. He funded our ships. In the churches, priests murmured. He rebuilt our altars. And in Rome, the Pope's messengers frowned. He holds our gold. Within a week, pressure began to build. Money has no morality, but it does have momentum. And soon, Florence began to feel it slipping away. Trade slowed, credit froze, merchants hesitated. The Albizzi had won the argument, but they were losing the economy. Florence without Medici gold was like a body without blood. One night, after a secret meeting among the city's elders, a quiet decision was made. Cosimo would not be executed. He would be exiled. The sentence was spoken in whispers, for everyone knew, even in absence, his shadow would remain. He was escorted out of Florence under guard. His eyes fixed on the city's skyline, the unfinished dome of the Duomo, the towers, the glint of the river. He did not look back, but those who watched him go later said the wind carried his last words. You can exile a man, but not his gold. From Venice, where he took refuge, Cosimo began to weave his web again. Letters traveled across borders under false seals. Deals were struck in taverns and chapels. Gold moved unseen. His bank survived, and quietly so did his influence. In less than a year, Florence's coffers were running dry. The city turned pale, starving for the same lifeblood it had once despised. Then, as if history itself had drawn a quiet breath, The doors of the Palazzo Vecchio opened again. Cosimo was invited back, not as a prisoner, but as Florence's savior. The streets were silent as he entered the city, his carriage rolling over the cobblestones that had betrayed him. People bowed their heads, not in worship, but in respect. They knew, finally, who ruled Florence, not by sword but by debt. Cosimo returned with patience and purpose. He rebuilt the Medici Bank even stronger than before. He forgave his enemies publicly, and quietly ruined them financially. The Albizzi disappeared from Florence's power map as easily as ink washed off parchment. And yet, Cosimo spoke little of revenge. His goal was subtler: to make Florence immortal. He turned his wealth toward art and architecture. The dome of Santa Maria del Fiore was completed under his patronage. The convent of San Marco became a sanctuary of learning and beauty. The walls of Florence bloomed with frescoes, and every brushstroke whispered his legacy. To outsiders, he was Cosimo the Elder. To the Florentines, he was the father of the city. But the price of greatness is restlessness. Late at night, walking through his vast library, one of the first of its kind in Europe, Cosimo would run his fingers along the spines of ancient manuscripts. The candlelight flickered on his face as he murmured, "Gold built this, but wisdom will keep it." He understood what most men never did. Wealth was only a bridge to something higher, influence over time itself. Outside, in the quiet squares, the sound of Florence had changed. No longer just the hammer on stone or the cry of merchants, but the hush of creation, of art, of learning, of ambition. The Renaissance was being born in whispers and ink, financed by invisible hands. Still, Florence remained fragile. The Medici were powerful, but power had become a mirror, reflecting both light and danger. Cosimo's sons were already being watched, envied, plotted against. In the eyes of the young and proud, gold was no longer a tool, it was a weapon. And in the corners of Florence's taverns, the same old phrase began to echo again: "Gold never sleeps." Cosimo de' Medici would die in his bed, an old man loved and feared. His funeral was silent. His body carried through the same streets that had once cheered his return. Florence wept, and yet, even in grief, the counting houses did not close. The books were still balanced. The ledgers still turned. Because while one Medici had died, another was already waiting in the wings. Lorenzo, his grandson, a man whose name would soon outshine every coin in Florence. The world had seen the birth of money's power. But now, it would witness what happens when power itself begins to believe it is divine. The bells of Florence rang in a new dawn. It was not the cry of war nor the echo of fear this time. It was the sound of celebration. Cosimo was gone, but his blood lived on in the veins of a young man who would make Florence shine brighter than ever before. His name was Lorenzo de' Medici, and history would remember him as Lorenzo il Magnifico, Lorenzo the Magnificent. He was born into gold, yet he wore it lightly. His smile was disarming, his mind sharp as the quill of a scribe. He could quote poets and command soldiers, discuss theology with monks and laugh with commoners in the streets. Florence had never seen such a man, a banker who moved like a prince. And though his fortune came from ledgers, his heart belonged to art. Under Lorenzo, Florence became more than a city. It became an idea, a living dream of beauty and brilliance. He funded painters, sculptors, architects. He discovered a young man named Michelangelo, barely 15, chiseling marble as if it could breathe. He gathered poets and philosophers under his roof, where music floated through candlelit halls. His palace was filled with laughter, color, and the scent of olive oil and ink. The Medici Bank still thrived, its reach vast and invisible. Gold moved across Europe like quiet thunder, from London's wool markets to Rome's Vatican treasuries. Yet Lorenzo began to treat money differently. For his grandfather, gold was power. For him, gold was grace. He believed that beauty could shape men more deeply than war ever could. But beauty like gold is expensive. Florence glimmered, but its foundations trembled. The city's prosperity depended on faith. The kind of faith that gold could be turned into glory. Yet not all shared Lorenzo's dream. Beyond the marble walls of his palace, whispers began to spread. Lorenzo spends as if God himself writes his accounts. His artists dine on silver while the workers starve. He plays with power as if it were a painting. And in Rome, where the Pope's bankers watched every coin, the Medici name had begun to stir resentment. The church still remembered the quiet manipulations of Cosimo. Now, his grandson's extravagance seemed almost blasphemous. Still, Lorenzo moved with grace and charm. He soothed rivals with a word, won enemies with a feast, and turned politics into theater. His eyes sparkled with the same confidence that had once filled the ledgers of his ancestors. But he forgot the oldest rule of Florence. Gold never sleeps, and neither do its enemies. In 1478, the city awoke to blood. During High Mass in the great cathedral, as the choir sang and incense filled the air, assassins struck. Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano were attacked by conspirators, the Puzzi family, driven by envy and Rome's secret blessing. The dagger flashes were fast, merciless. Giuliano fell, bleeding onto the marble floor. Lorenzo, wounded, fought his way out, blood staining his fine robes. The church echoed with screams and chaos. Florence trembled, its beauty stained by betrayal. But Lorenzo survived, and his survival changed everything. The conspirators were hunted down. Vengeance swept the city like fire. The bells tolled again, but this time for the dead. The Puzzi name was erased from stone and memory alike. Yet in his heart, something in Lorenzo broke that day. He had seen what gold and glory could buy, and what they could not protect. After the blood dried, he ruled with greater wisdom, but also greater sorrow. He poured his energy into peace, into maintaining Florence's fragile balance amid the storms of Europe. He wrote poetry about love and mortality, as if he knew the Renaissance itself was mortal. In his twilight years, Lorenzo would sit in his garden, surrounded by marble statues and fountains, reading Dante beneath the cypress trees. The sound of the city drifted around him. Merchants bargaining, painters arguing, children laughing. He had built this world, and yet it felt like sand slipping through his fingers. The Medici Bank, too, was beginning to weaken. Overspending, corruption, and failed branches eroded its strength. The once perfect ledgers began to show red ink. Quiet, creeping, fatal. But Lorenzo no longer cared for numbers. He cared for legacy. He believed that if Florence could teach the world to see beauty, then even when its gold was gone, its light would remain. And in this perhaps he was right. When Lorenzo died in 1492, the city fell silent. Painters, poets, and princes wept. The bells of Florence tolled not in anger, but in mourning. He was the last great flame of a golden age. And as his body was carried to rest, the Arno River flowed quietly beside the city, as if whispering goodbye. Florence, once the heart of Europe's wealth, was now at a crossroads. The Medici had turned gold into greatness, but without them, who would hold the balance? In the echo of Lorenzo's death, the streets began to fill with new voices. Voices not of merchants or artists, but of prophets, men who saw sin where others saw art. And among them rose one who would burn the very heart of Florence's beauty, and with it, the Medici's empire. The city that invented money was about to learn how quickly faith and fortune can turn to ashes. The air in Florence had changed. The sweet fragrance of oil paint and blooming gardens was gone, replaced by smoke, not from war, but from burning books, silks, and mirrors. It was as if the city itself had turned against its reflection. The year was 1494. Lorenzo the Magnificent was dead. His son, Piero de' Medici, inherited his wealth but not his wisdom. The once golden name of Medici now hung heavy in the streets. Debts had grown. The bank was failing. And in the silence that followed the death of a patron, a new voice began to rise, harsh, holy, and unforgiving. He was Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar with a voice like thunder and eyes that burned with prophecy. He preached not of gold or beauty, but of fire, the fire of God's wrath upon vanity. His sermons filled the cathedral, his words cutting through Florence like the wind that strips leaves from trees. He called the Medici sinners, the artists deceivers, the wealthy thieves of the poor. He said Florence had sold its soul for splendor, and the people listened. They listened because the splendor had begun to fade. When Lorenzo had ruled, gold had been faith. Now faith itself was gold. Savonarola's words spread like sparks. He declared Florence the new Jerusalem, a city chosen to cleanse the world of corruption. He demanded that citizens bring their finery, their jewels, their paintings, their books of poetry, anything that tempted pride, to be burned in the great square. And they came. One by one, people dragged treasures from their homes, velvet gowns, musical instruments, portraits painted by masters. Even the young Botticelli, who had once painted goddesses in soft light, brought his own works to the flames, trembling as they turned to ash. The fire roared high into the winter sky, a bonfire of the vanities. It was the sound of Florence destroying itself. Meanwhile, the Medici were being swept away by history. Piero, called the Unfortunate, had neither his father's charm nor his grandfather's cunning. When the French King Charles VIII invaded Italy, Piero panicked. He surrendered the city's fortresses without a fight, hoping to buy peace with obedience. The people, humiliated and enraged, stormed the palazzo. The Medici palaces were looted, their treasures scattered. And just like that, the dynasty that had ruled Florence for nearly a century, with gold instead of swords, was gone. The Medici fled into exile once more, as their ledgers burned beside the works of art they had once funded. For a time, Savonarola ruled the city, not as a prince, but as a prophet. Florence, he said, would now live pure. He banned music, dancing, gambling, and love songs. The city of art and commerce fell silent, its laughter gone. But history has no patience for extremes. What begins in fire often ends in smoke. Soon, the same people who had followed him began to fear him. Trade suffered, money vanished, and the beauty that had drawn the world to Florence disappeared. Even the Pope grew weary of his defiance. Rome excommunicated him. Florence turned restless. And one spring morning in 1498, as dawn crept over the rooftops, Savonarola himself was dragged to the very same square where he had built his bonfires. The crowd that once praised him now shouted for his death. His body was burned to ash, and the wind carried him away, as it had carried the Medici before him. The fire died. The silence returned. Florence, stripped of its gold and its glory, was left with only memory. The marble walls that had once gleamed in candlelight now seemed pale and haunted. The banks were gone, the art was gone, the laughter was gone. And yet, beneath the ashes, something still breathed. The idea of Florence, the dream of power born from paper and faith, had not died. In a quiet villa outside the city, a surviving branch of the Medici family waited, watching, learning. They had seen their power rise from numbers and ledgers. They had seen it fall to pride and faith. Now they would learn how to reclaim it, not as bankers but as rulers. For the Medici had always known, money is only the beginning of power. The rest is patience. And soon, Florence would see their return, not as merchants of gold, but as masters of destiny. The winds over Tuscany carried whispers once again. Florence, weary from revolution and repentance, stood hollow and uncertain. Its markets were quiet, its palaces dim. The scent of burnt parchment and faded frescoes lingered in the air. The Medici were gone, yet somehow their shadow never truly left. Far beyond the city, in the hills of Tuscany and the courts of Europe, the surviving Medici plotted their return. They had lost their gold, their homes, their pride, but not their knowledge. They understood what Florence itself had forgotten, Power was not destroyed, it was merely displaced. Years passed. Italy changed. Kings and mercenaries carved its map like bread, and the city-states trembled. Florence, once radiant with wealth, now stood fragile, politically adrift. The Republican leaders who had exiled the Medici could not hold the city together. Factions fought, alliances shifted, and the people longed for stability. In Rome, the papal throne had become a seat not only of faith but of finance, and who better to manage faith than those who once invented credit? Among the Medici exiles was a man named Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici, the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Raised in exile, he was no ordinary man. Intelligent, patient, and perfectly schooled in the dual languages of politics and money. And when the moment came, he seized it not with armies, but with alliances. In 1512, the Spanish forces entered Florence, and behind their banners, quietly, the Medici returned. No grand speeches, no parades. Only the slow, deliberate reweaving of the web that had once held the city together. The Republic fell. The Medici were home again. Florence exhaled. The exiles who had once burned their portraits now hurried to light candles in their honor. Old enemies offered apologies. New allies offered oaths. And Giovanni, calm and observant, walked through the streets his ancestors had built, gazing at the fading frescoes and cracked marble, like a doctor returning to his patient after a long illness. But Giovanni's ambition reached beyond Florence. In 1513, history shifted once more. Giovanni was elected Pope Leo X. The Medici had done what no banking family had ever done before. They had placed one of their own on the papal throne. From banker to priest. From exile to emperor of faith. The Vatican became the Medici's grandest bank, and the spiritual capital of Christendom its richest client. Under Leo X, gold and glory flooded the church. He commissioned grand works of art, Raphael's frescoes, the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica. He declared, "God has given us the papacy, now let us enjoy it. But enjoyment has a cost." The indulgences, papers sold for forgiveness, became the church's new currency. And while the Medici managed heaven's treasury, they unknowingly sparked a fire that would soon split Europe. In the north, a monk named Martin Luther was watching, writing, and waiting. The Reformation was brewing, and its roots, in a way, grew from Florence's gold. Back in the city, the Medici influence deepened. Lorenzo II de' Medici, Leo's nephew, ruled Florence as duke. The city that once called itself a republic was now becoming a principality. Slowly, carefully, irreversibly. The people, tired of chaos, accepted it. They traded liberty for peace, and paper crowns for marble stability. The palaces gleamed again. The workshops reopened. Art returned, but this time it had a new tone. Less divine, more political. Portraits no longer worshipped beauty. They glorified power. The Medici faces appeared everywhere. On coins, on altars, in frescoes. Their gold had become symbol. Their name a seal of inevitability. Yet, within their grand halls, a quiet melancholy remained. Florence was no longer the dream it had once been. The laughter of Lorenzo's age was gone, replaced by calculation. The soul of the Renaissance, that shimmering blend of faith, beauty, and curiosity, had turned into an empire of survival. Still, the Medici knew how to adapt. Their bank, though weakened, became secondary to something far greater, the control of hearts and minds through culture. They financed scholars, poets, architects. They turned politics into performance. The family that once invented money now invented image. And as the century turned, a young Medici woman, Catherine de' Medici, was being raised in the shadows of this power. She listened, learned, and remembered. She would one day carry Florence's cunning to the throne of France itself, turning the lessons of her ancestors into a new kind of diplomacy, one of poison, pearls, and persuasion. But for now, Florence slept under a new kind of silence. The city that once sang with gold now whispered with fear and memory. The Medici had returned, not as bankers of faith, but as architects of control. And somewhere, deep within the Palazzo Medici, The ledgers of old still rested beneath dust. The ink had faded, but the truth remained. Florence had traded its freedom for stability, its creativity for order, its heartbeat for balance. The city that invented money had learned the most painful rule of all. That power can never be owned, only borrowed. The year was 1492. A year that marked both the discovery of new worlds and the quiet dusk of an old one. In Florence, the Medici family stood at a crossroads. Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Lorenzo il Magnifico, Lorenzo the Magnificent, had passed away. His death was not just the end of a man, but of an era. The city that once sang with the hum of commerce and art was now haunted by the echoes of its own brilliance. The Medici Bank, once the most powerful in Europe, had begun to crumble long before Lorenzo's death. Bad loans, political enemies, and the slow rot of overconfidence had eaten at its foundations. Yet even as the numbers failed, the legend grew. Florence was still seen as the mother of money, the cradle of capitalism. But behind its golden facade, cracks had begun to spread. Imagine the city now. The air heavy with the scent of ink and parchment, coins clinking faintly in the counting houses that remained. The bankers who had once stood tall in the palaces now whispered behind closed doors, their ledgers filled with red ink. The church, too, had turned its gaze elsewhere. Rome was becoming the new center of wealth, and Florence, proud, defiant Florence, was losing its crown. Still, something remarkable lingered in the silence. The Medici had planted seeds that would outlast them. Their patronage of artists, thinkers, and architects had changed the very soul of Europe. Their method of using trust and paper, of turning faith into finance, had shaped the modern economy. The instruments they invented, letters of credit, bills of exchange, international branches, would become the DNA of global banking. Even as the Medici name wavered, their idea of wealth, abstract, mobile, almost spiritual, lived on. Gold had become a concept, not a substance. It no longer glittered in vaults. It flowed invisibly through words, numbers, and promises. Far from Florence, their methods were being adopted and refined. In Venice, merchants learned to use bills of exchange to fund voyages to the east. In Antwerp, bankers followed Medici ledgers to finance kings. In London, centuries later, these same ideas would birth the world's first central bank. But in Florence, the streets seemed quieter. The Medici palaces still stood, majestic and solemn, their walls whispering tales of artists' power and intrigue. The stones themselves seemed to remember the touch of genius. Inside the old Palazzo Medici Riccardi, servants moved slowly under candlelight, polishing the marble floors where Cosimo once walked, where Lorenzo had listened to poets and philosophers. The Medici had made their mark not only in trade, but in the imagination of mankind. Their gold had been transmuted into something immortal, beauty, art, and thought. Yet there was melancholy in the air. The people of Florence whispered that their city had lost its magic. The fairs that once drew merchants from distant lands were now smaller, quieter. The coin that bore the lily of Florence still circulated, the florin, but its supremacy was fading. In the shadow of the grand cathedral, an old banker closed his ledger one last time. His hands trembled as he touched the pages, the same kind of pages that had once carried the signatures of kings. He looked up at the dome of Brunelleschi, gleaming in the fading light, and he smiled faintly. "We turned faith into fortune," he murmured. "And fortune back into faith." Side bells rang. The sound carried through the narrow streets, echoing off stone and memory. It was the sound of Florence breathing, slow, soft, but alive. In another room, a young apprentice lit a candle. He began to copy a ledger, neat, careful handwriting, just as his master had taught him. On the margin, he wrote a small note in Latin, "Pecunia non olet." Money does not smell. He had no idea that one day, centuries later, his simple act of record-keeping would be mirrored in glowing screens and digital codes. That one day, the spirit of Florence would live inside every transaction in the world. The Medici were fading, but their idea had escaped time itself. And Florence, though forgotten by power, remained the dream that had invented money. Listen closely. Do you hear the hum beneath the silence? It's the heartbeat of the first bankers, still echoing beneath the cobblestones. The silence of Florence did not mean the end of its influence. Like ripples spreading from a stone dropped into still water, the ideas born in that small Tuscan city began to move outward, slowly, invisibly, but with unstoppable force. Across the Alps, merchants, kings, and scholars whispered the names of the Florentine masters. Medici, Bardi, Peruzzi. Their methods became the unseen architecture of empires. The Medici might have fallen, but their invention, the language of money, was now spoken by the world. Picture this, the late 15th century. In the candle-lit counting rooms of Bruges, a Flemish merchant carefully unrolls a letter of credit, signed in Florence. He reads the name Medici Bank, though the branch has long since closed. It doesn't matter. The reputation remains powerful. The paper itself carries a strange holiness, a promise backed not by a church, but by trust. The merchant folds it gently, seals it with wax, and sends it on its journey to London, where it will unlock trade worth more than any coin chest could ever carry. The miracle was quiet but revolutionary. Money no longer needed to move. It could exist in the mind, in faith, written on parchment and believed by all. And this belief, this fragile thread of trust, became stronger than any army. The kings of Europe soon realized that true power did not lie in swords or ships, but in the invisible web of finance. Spain could conquer new lands, but needed Florence's ideas to fund its fleets. France could wage war, but had to borrow from bankers who traced their methods back to the Arno. Even England, cautious and proud, began to learn from the Italians. When Henry VII of England sought to stabilize his kingdom, he turned to the Lombard merchants, descendants of Florentine techniques, who brought with them the spirit of Renaissance banking. In time, these methods would give rise to the Bank of England centuries later. In the Netherlands, a new city, Amsterdam, rose on trade, credit, and trust. It became the new Florence of the North, but its bones were built with Tuscan stone. The Amsterdam Exchange Bank, founded in 1609, was in many ways a Medici reborn, a place where invisible wealth took visible form. And from Amsterdam, the idea spread further still, across oceans, into colonies, and eventually into the very fabric of modern capitalism. Florence had done something extraordinary. It had turned human imagination into currency. It had taught the world that wealth could exist in promise, not possession. That trust, if strong enough, could replace gold. Even as the Medici faded into legend, their name was invoked in every ledger, every contract, every transaction that depended on belief. Their double-entry bookkeeping became the quiet heartbeat of commerce, the system that allowed empires to rise and economies to survive. Imagine for a moment the unseen chain connecting them all. A Florentine goldsmith counting coins in a stone workshop by the Arno. A Venetian trader writing a bill of exchange in his ship's cabin. A London banker signing a note under the gaslight of Threadneedle Street. A modern analyst typing numbers into a glowing screen in New York. Each of them linked, by method, by trust, by the ghost of Florence. The Medici's story had become myth, but their creation lived on in the pulse of every market. Florence, that cradle of beauty and commerce, had given humanity a new kind of power, one that didn't depend on swords, kings, or gods. It depended only on belief. And that belief, fragile, invisible, eternal, became the foundation of the modern world. Some say the soul of Florence still moves through money itself. The shimmer of gold, the curve of a coin, the quiet hum of numbers whispered between hands. All of it is a memory of when the world first learned to dream in currency. By the dawn of the 16th century, Florence no longer held the keys to Europe's wealth. The Medici family, though still powerful in name, were now shadows of their ancestors. Princes instead of bankers, politicians instead of visionaries. They had traded their ledgers for thrones, their gold dust for crowns. Cosimo de' Medici had once ruled from behind the curtain, letting others take the stage while he moved the strings quietly, like a maestro. But his descendants, blinded by their own glory, stepped into the light. And there, under the harsh gaze of history, they began to fall. Florence had changed too. The air was heavier. The markets, once alive with chatter and coin, had grown subdued. The city that had invented modern finance had become its victim, tangled in debts, wars, and shifting alliances. The Medici Bank had long collapsed, its branches shuttered, its ledgers gathering dust in the dim corners of old palazzos. And yet, even in decline, Florence was beautiful. The city glowed as if carved from memory. Marble and sunlight, gold leaf and shadow. Artists still worked by candlelight, painting for popes who paid with Florentine methods. Architects still built cathedrals whose stones were laid by money that no longer existed. Every dome, every fresco, every sculpture carried within it the spirit of the first bankers, the belief that imagination could be measured, valued, exchanged. It was said that even when the Medici Bank had nothing left but air and faith, their letters of credit were still accepted everywhere in Europe. Such was the power of the name. It was a strange sort of immortality, not of blood but of trust. Elsewhere the world was changing fast. Empires were rising, fueled by the new flow of gold from the Americas. Trade routes shifted from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. Venice waned, and so did Florence. Now it was Lisbon, Antwerp, London, and soon Amsterdam that ruled the tides of wealth. But if you listened closely, in the dim courtyards of Florence, you could still hear whispers of the old order. A merchant's son reading from an inherited ledger. A scholar reciting a passage from Ficino about the divine nature of numbers. An artist sketching the face of Lorenzo the Magnificent from memory. Eyes bright with nostalgia. They remembered what the world had forgotten. That the Medici had not merely created wealth. They had transformed human thought. They had taught people to imagine value, to believe that something unseen could be real, to trade not only gold and goods but dreams and futures. That invisible revolution became the foundation upon which modern economies were built. Even centuries later, economists and financiers would study those early Florentine methods, the balance of accounts, the circulation of credit, and marvel at their sophistication. The Medici may have fallen, but their shadow lay across every vault and every market that came after. Somewhere, deep within the archives of Florence, among the brittle pages and faded ink, the first whispers of modern finance still sleep. They wait, quiet and patient, beneath the dust of centuries. And sometimes, when the evening light filters through the narrow streets and touches the old stones, it feels as though the city itself is breathing. Slow, warm, eternal, remembering. The tourists who walk the streets today cannot see it, but it is there. The ghost of gold beneath their feet. The pulse of trust in the air. The faint echo of the counting houses, where faith first learned to take form. Florence had taught the world how to create wealth, and how to lose it. It had shown humanity that all empires, even those built on gold, are only as strong as the dreams that sustain them. As the last of the Medici line looked out over their fading city, they could not have known that their experiment had already succeeded. Not in Florence, but in every city that would ever trade, build, or dream again. And so, as the Arno River flowed quietly beneath the bridges, golden in the evening sun, it carried with it the reflection of everything Florence had ever been, and everything it would forever inspire. Do you feel it? That gentle hum beneath the story? It is time softly turning the pages. The night in Florence is still. The river Arno moves quietly under its bridges, reflecting the dim glow of lanterns that hang like fading stars. The city sleeps, but the stones remember. In one forgotten room of the old Medici palace, a single candle burns. Its flame trembles, casting long shadows over the walls that once heard the voices of kings, artists, and bankers. On a wooden table lies a book, a ledger, its cover cracked, its pages yellowed with time. Someone, we don't know who, opens it. Dust rises like a sigh. The handwriting is elegant, Florentine. A name glimmers faintly in the flickering light. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici. And then, beneath it, a single unfinished line. The ink has faded but not disappeared. It reads, There is always another account yet to open. The candle flickers. Outside, the wind hums softly through the streets that once sang with the music of commerce and gold. Florence gave birth to a miracle, a language of trust written not in stone, but in belief. From those quiet halls, the modern world emerged. Yet even now, centuries later, no one truly knows how far the Medici shadow reaches. Every number typed on a glowing screen, every card swiped, every silent digital transfer, they all whisper back to that room, to that candle, to that ledger. It's as if the spirit of Florence never left. It just changed form, slipping unseen through time, turning from parchment to code, from ink to algorithm. And somewhere, maybe even now, a new banker sits in another city, looking into the glow of his screen, seeing numbers move as if by magic, and feeling for just a second that same invisible thrill the Medici once knew. That quiet realization, that power no longer lives in gold, but in belief. So close your eyes now. Listen to the slow rhythm of your breath. In and out, in and out. Feel the weight of centuries lift from your shoulders. The hum of the city fades. The sound of coins becomes only a memory, a soft echo in the distance. Imagine the streets of Florence at dawn. Golden, timeless. A single breeze moves through the arches, carrying with it the whisper of a secret that began 600 years ago, and is still not finished. Somewhere, another account is opening, another promise is being written, and history is waiting to balance its books again. Good night, Florence. Good night, gold. Good night to the city that taught the world how to believe.